She was the punchline of every cruel office joke, the heavy girl everyone walked right past. Until the city's most ruthless crime boss decided she was his. Now the men who laughed at her are begging for their lives, and the girl nobody wanted has become the prize he'll kill to keep. Claire Jenkins knew the unspoken rules of corporate galas. Stand near the walls, hold a drink to look occupied, and never ever draw attention to yourself. At 240 pounds, Claire was not just curvy or thick, she was undeniably, unapologetically fat. In the sleek, hyper-competitive world of Chicago's high-end logistics industry, where the women starved themselves to fit into size 2 Armani suits, and the men measured their worth in Rolexes, Claire was an anomaly. She was a brilliant senior accountant at Rossi Imports, but to her colleagues, she was just the punchline to a cruel joke. The annual holiday gala was in full swing at the historic Palmer House Hilton. The grand ballroom, with its frescoed ceiling and glittering chandeliers, felt suffocating. Claire wore a deep emerald velvet gown. She had painstakingly tailored it herself, because finding a dress off the rack that accommodated her wide hips and heavy bust without looking like a shapeless tent was impossible. For a brief moment in her apartment mirror, she had felt beautiful. That illusion shattered the moment she walked into the ballroom. She had retreated to a small cocktail table near the buffet, trying to blend into the shadows when the voices drifted over. They were loud, slurred with premium gin, and intentionally cruel. "I'm just saying, physics is physics, Jess," came the voice of Ryan Davis, a mid-level finance director whose tailored tuxedo couldn't hide his bloated ego. Jessica Arrington, the lead HR director, giggled into her champagne flute. "Ryan, stop. She's going to hear you." "Let her," Ryan scoffed, leaning against a pillar. "Look at her hovering by the buffet. It's like a moth to a flame. I've got $500 right now that says if she sits on one of those antique Chiavari chairs, the legs snap. Any takers?" The small group of junior executives around them erupted into muffled, cruel laughter. Claire's blood ran cold. The heavy velvet of her dress suddenly felt like a lead blanket. The heat of humiliation crept up her thick neck, flushing her cheeks bright red. She wanted the polished marble floor to open up and swallow her whole. She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling so badly her drink sloshed against the rim of her glass. She wasn't going to cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry over these empty, shallow people anymore. "I'll take that bet." The voice cut through the laughter like a jagged piece of ice. It was low, gravelly, and carried a dangerous resonance that instantly silenced the surrounding crowd. Claire looked up. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Stepping out from the VIP alcove was Gabriel Rossi. He was the silent owner of Rossi Imports, a man who rarely showed his face at corporate events. At 34, Gabriel was a phantom in the Chicago business world, but a god in its criminal underbelly. Rumors swirled about him like dark clouds that his logistics company was just a front for the largest organized crime syndicate in the Midwest, that he had men buried beneath the foundations of the new O'Hare terminal. He was terrifyingly handsome, with sharp, predatory features, pitch-black hair, and eyes as cold and unforgiving as slate. He wore a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo that cost more than Claire's yearly salary. Gabriel didn't look at Ryan immediately. His dark eyes locked onto Claire. He took in her flushed face, the unshed tears gleaming in her eyes, the way she instinctively tried to cross her arms to hide her heavy body. Something violent and possessive flashed in his gaze. He slowly turned his head to Ryan. The finance director had gone completely pale, his smug grin melting into an expression of absolute terror. "Mr. Rossi," Ryan stammered, his voice cracking. We were just joking around." "A joke," Gabriel repeated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Ryan. The crowd parted for him, as if he were parting the Red Sea. "Explain the punchline to me, Ryan. I want to laugh." "Sir, Gabriel reached out, his large, scarred hand grabbing the collar of Ryan's tuxedo. With a terrifying show of brute strength, he slammed the man backward into the gilded plaster pillar. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. Jessica shrieked, covering her mouth. "You think her body is a joke?" Gabriel's voice was a lethal whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard it. "You think the woman I've chosen is something for you to place bets on?" Claire gasped. The room began to spin. The woman he's chosen, she had never spoken a single word to Gabriel Rossi in her life. "She was just an accountant on the 4th floor. I didn't know, Mr. Ray." "Rossi, I swear to God I didn't know she was yours." Ryan sobbed, his feet dangling slightly off the ground as Gabriel held him by the throat. "She is the air I breathe," Gabriel snarled, his grip tightening. "And you are polluting it." Gabriel dropped Ryan to the floor. The man collapsed, gasping for air, clutching his throat. Gabriel casually adjusted his cuffs, his eyes completely devoid of mercy. He looked at 2 burly men standing near the exit, his security. "Take him," Gabriel ordered quietly. "Make sure he understands the gravity of disrespecting my future wife. He doesn't work for me anymore, and if I see his face in Chicago again, he won't have a face left." The 2 guards hauled a weeping Ryan out of the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Gabriel turned his back on the terrified executives and walked straight toward Claire. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She felt massive, clumsy, and entirely out of her depth as this terrifying, beautiful man approached her. He stopped inches from her. Up close, he smelled of bergamot, expensive tobacco, and pure, unfiltered danger. He looked down at her, his cold eyes suddenly softening into something that looked dangerously like worship. "Green is my favorite color," he murmured, lifting a heavy, calloused hand to gently brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His thumb grazed her full cheek. "You look like a queen, Claire." How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know everything about you," he replied, sliding his hand down to rest firmly on her wide waist, his long fingers pressing into her soft curves. He didn't shy away from her size. He gripped her like she was the most precious, solid thing in his world. "I've been watching you for 6 months. I was waiting for the right time to introduce myself. But seeing these rats disrespect you, my patience ran out." "Talk." He firmly took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We're leaving. But my coat, I'll buy you 1,000 coats," Gabriel said, leading her toward the exit. He stopped and cast one final sweeping glare over the crowd. "Listen to me closely. Claire Jenkins is untouchable. If anyone looks at her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will tear this building down with you inside it." The transition into Gabriel Rossi's world was a whiplash of silk, steel, and terrifying devotion. Claire woke up the next morning in the penthouse of the St. Regis Chicago, a sprawling masterpiece of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Lake Michigan. She had expected to be sent home in a taxi after the gala. Instead, Gabriel had brought her here, ordered her a feast from a 5-star kitchen, and simply sat in an armchair, drinking scotch and watching her eat with a look of ravenous fascination. He hadn't touched her beyond kissing her hand. He treated her as if she were made of spun glass. Yet he looked at her thick thighs and round stomach with an unmasked primal hunger. Within 48 hours, Claire's life was unrecognizable. She didn't return to her desk on the 4th floor. Instead, Gabriel's personal assistant, a stoic woman named Maria, arrived at Claire's modest Logan Square apartment and packed her essential belongings. "Mr. Rossi prefers you stay with him," Maria had said, handing Claire a black platinum credit card. He also requested that you update your wardrobe. He specifically mentioned he wants to see you in fabrics that highlight your curves, not hide them. Claire felt like a fraud. For 28 years, society had told her she took up too much space. Fashion magazines, doctors, and men like Ryan had driven the message home. Shrink. Be less. Hide. But Gabriel demanded the opposite. He wanted her to take up all the space. When she nervously tried on a custom-made crimson silk dress for him one evening, she tried to suck in her stomach. Gabriel had immediately crossed the room, his large hands resting on her hips, forcing her to relax. "Don't," he had growled, his lips pressing against the soft, bare flesh of her shoulder. "Never shrink yourself for me, Claire. I want every inch of you. You are a goddess, and I will not let you hide my religion." The romance was intoxicating, but the undercurrent of Gabriel's reality was a dark, violent river. A week after the Palmer House incident, the news broke. Ryan Davis was found brutally beaten in an alleyway near Lower Wacker Drive. Both of his legs were shattered, broken in a way that ensured he would never walk normally again. The police called it a random mugging, but Claire knew the truth. When she confronted Gabriel in his study, her hands shaking as she held up the news article on her phone, he didn't even blink. "I told him there would be consequences," Gabriel said calmly, signing a stack of shipping manifests. "Gabriel, you broke his legs over a stupid bet." Gabriel stood up, rounding the massive mahogany desk. He stepped into her personal space, caging her against the edge of the desk. He didn't look angry, he looked entirely resolute. "He bet that you would break a chair, Claire," Gabriel whispered, his thumb tracing her jawline. "So I broke him. It's simple mathematics. You need to understand something, Mia Vita. You are mine. My woman, my heart. In my world, weakness is blood in the water. If I let a peasant mock my queen, I lose respect. And without respect, we both die." Claire shivered, a conflicting mix of sheer terror and deep, twisted arousal pooling in her stomach. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever deemed her worthy of protection, let alone bloodshed. But Gabriel's ruthless possessiveness was about to be put to the ultimate test. 2 weeks later, Gabriel had to attend a sit-down at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street. It was supposed to be a peace summit with the O'Connor family, a rival Irish syndicate operating out of the South Side. Gabriel insisted Claire come with him. "They need to see you," he told her in the back of his armored Maybach. "They need to know who stands beside me." The private dining room at Gibson's was suffocatingly tense. The air smelled of charred bone-in ribeyes, expensive bourbon, and barely contained hostility. Tommy the Rat O'Connor sat across the heavy oak table. He was a greasy, gaunt man with a reputation for viciousness and a profound lack of filter. Claire sat tightly beside Gabriel, wearing a fitted black wrap dress. She felt entirely out of place among these hardened, heavily armed men. The business negotiations went smoothly at first. Territories were discussed. Percentages were agreed upon. But as the third bottle of wine was emptied, Tommy's eyes began to linger heavily on Claire. He stared openly at her heavy chest, then down to the thick curve of her hips, resting against the chair. A sleazy, drunken grin spread across his face. "I gotta say, Rossi," Tommy slurred, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "I heard you got yourself a new girl. I was expecting some runway model. But I see you like 'em with some serious meat on the bone." The temperature in the room plummeted. The clinking of silverware stopped. Claire froze, her stomach twisting into a painful knot. Here it was again, the inevitable punchline. Tommy let out a raspy laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Hell, with an appetite like yours, Gabriel, I guess you need a girl who knows her way around a buffet line. What is she, $1.80? $200? You got a roller and flour to find thee. Tommy didn't get to finish his sentence. Gabriel moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that defied his size. In a fraction of a second, he reached across the table, grabbed the heavy serrated steak knife from his plate, and drove it violently downward. The blade pierced straight through the back of Tommy O'Connor's right hand, pinning it completely to the solid oak table. Tommy's agonizing, blood-curdling scream echoed off the wood-paneled walls. The Irish guards jumped up, reaching into their jackets, but Gabriel's men already had their guns drawn, aiming directly at the heads of the O'Connor crew. Gabriel didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood over the table, still gripping the handle of the knife buried in Tommy's hand. Blood pooled rapidly around the pristine white china. "Look at her again," Gabriel hissed, his voice vibrating with a demonic rage, his eyes locked onto Tommy's wide, tear-filled eyes. "Speak about her again. Breathe in her direction again. And I won't take your hand, Tommy. I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs in the alley." Tommy sobbed, his face turning a sickly gray as he stared at the knife pinning him to the wood. Okay. Jesus Christ, Rossi, I'm sorry." Gabriel twisted the knife slightly, eliciting another shriek of agony before abruptly yanking it out. He tossed the bloody blade onto Tommy's plate. Gabriel turned to Claire. The murderous rage in his eyes vanished the second he looked at her, replaced by that terrifying, obsessive devotion. He held out his clean hand to her. "Come, my love," he said softly, completely ignoring the bleeding mob boss and the guns drawn all around them. "The atmosphere here has lost its appeal." As Claire placed her trembling hand in his and let him lead her out of the restaurant, a chilling realization settled deep in her bones. Gabriel Rossi wasn't just defending her honor. He was obsessed. She was his prize, his treasure, his living idol, and he was fully prepared to burn down the entire city of Chicago to keep her on the pedestal he had built for her. The knife plunged through Tommy O'Connor's hand was a declaration of war, and within 24 hours the streets of Chicago bled. Gabriel's penthouse became an impenetrable fortress. Armed guardsmen built like freight trains in bespoke suits patrolled the gilded corridors. Claire spent her days pacing the expansive marble floors, the weight of the escalating violence pressing heavily on her chest. She had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, a wallflower apologizing for the space she occupied. Now she was the epicenter of a mob war, the singular obsession of the city's most lethal predator. Late one Tuesday night, the strain finally broke her. Unable to sleep, Claire retreated to the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen. She was stress-baking, covered in flour, vigorously kneading a massive mound of brioche dough. She wore only one of Gabriel's oversized black silk dress shirts, the fabric clinging to her generous curves, her thick thighs bare against the cold floor. She was crying softly, the tears sliding down her flushed cheeks. "You're weeping over the flour, Mia Regina." Claire jumped. Gabriel was leaning against the mahogany doorframe, his tie undone, looking exhausted but fiercely alert. He moved across the kitchen with the silent grace of a panther, coming to stand right behind her. He wrapped his massive arms around her wide waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, as if her scent of vanilla and fear was the only oxygen left in the world. "Gabriel, people are dying," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw the news. A warehouse blew up in the South Loop. You haven't slept in 3 days. All of this because of me, because Tommy made a joke about my weight." Gabriel spun her around. His hands gripped her thick upper arms, not to hurt her, but to ground her. "Do not ever say that. Do not diminish what you are to me. They didn't insult your weight, Claire. They insulted my soul. They looked at the only pure thing in my filthy life and tried to drag it into the mud." He pulled her flush against his chest, He loved how soft she was, how perfectly she yielded to his hard edges. You think you're a burden? You think you take up too much room? Claire, I want to build a world where you are the sun, and everyone else is just orbiting you. The O'Connors were dead the moment Tommy opened his mouth. I'm just doing the paperwork. Despite the sweetness of his dark devotion, the reality of their situation was closing in. Declan O'Connor, Tommy's older and far more cunning brother, had taken control of the Irish syndicate. Declan knew he couldn't hit Gabriel directly, so he aimed for the one thing Gabriel had explicitly marked as his weakness. The following Thursday, Claire begged for a semblance of normalcy. She just wanted a coffee from her favorite artisanal cafe in Wicker Park. Gabriel reluctantly agreed, sending his top enforcer, Leo, and 3 other armed men with her. The cafe was quiet, smelling of roasted beans and impending rain. Claire stood at the counter, paying for her latte, feeling a fleeting sense of her old, boring life. But the illusion shattered in an instant. A black SUV violently hopped the curb, smashing through the front plate glass window of the cafe. Glass exploded inward like shrapnel. People screamed. "Get down!" Leo roared, drawing his weapon as 3 men in tactical gear poured out of the SUV, semi-automatic rifles raised. Gunfire erupted, deafening and chaotic. The air filled with pulverized drywall and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Leo pushed Claire behind the heavy oak counter, returning fire with lethal precision, dropping the first attacker immediately. But there were too many. One of the hitmen managed to flank the counter. He was a hulking brute with a scarred face. He spotted Claire huddled on the floor. "Grab the fat bitch," another voice yelled from the front. "Declan wants her alive." The hitman lunged, grabbing Claire by the hair. She screamed in pain, desperately clawing at his tactical vest. "Come on, you heavy cow, move." The hitman grunted, struggling to haul her upward. He severely underestimated her solid mass and the sudden fierce will to live that Gabriel had ignited within her. Claire didn't shrink. She didn't let herself be dragged. Instead, she used the very body society had mocked to fight back. As the man yanked her forward, she planted her heavy boots firmly on the floor and threw all 240 pounds of her weight backward, dropping her center of gravity. The sudden shift broke the hitman's grip and sent him stumbling forward off balance. Before he could recover, Claire grabbed a boiling hot carafe of drip coffee from the lower shelf and hurled it directly into his face. The man shrieked, dropping his weapon and clutching his blistering skin. Claire didn't hesitate. She scrambled past him just as the front doors were completely blown off their hinges. Through the smoke and dust, Gabriel Rossi walked in. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like the devil incarnate. He held a customized Sig Sauer in one hand, his eyes scanning the carnage until they locked onto Claire. Seeing her covered in dust but unharmed, his rigid shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, but his eyes burned with a murderous hellfire. The remaining O'Connor hitmen realized too late who had just entered the building. Before they could aim, Gabriel and his backup team executed them with chilling mechanical efficiency. Gabriel stepped over a bleeding body, walking straight to the hitman writhing on the floor with a burned face. The man looked up, pure terror bleeding through his agony as Gabriel pointed the barrel of his gun directly between his eyes. "Who sent you?" Gabriel asked, his voice dead of all emotion. "Declan O'Connor." The man sobbed. "He said you were weak because of her. He said she was just a fat joke." Gabriel didn't say another word. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the ruined cafe. Gabriel holstered his weapon and turned to Claire. He crossed the debris-filled floor, falling to his knees right there in the shattered glass. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach, holding on to her as if she were a life raft in a violent storm. "I'm okay," Claire sobbed, burying her hands in his thick dark hair. "I fought back, Gabriel. I didn't let them take me." Gabriel looked up at her, wiping a streak of dust from her cheek. "I know, my queen. I know how strong you are. But tonight, this ends. Nobody will ever dare to look at you, speak of you, or think of you again without shivering in absolute terror." That night, Gabriel Rossi unleashed a biblical wrath upon the Chicago underworld. He didn't just send a message, he eradicated the messengers entirely. While Claire was safely secured in a subterranean panic room beneath the penthouse, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed guards, Gabriel and his men systematically dismantled the O'Connor empire. They burned their warehouses to the ground. They seized their supply lines. And finally, Gabriel personally kicked down the doors of Declan O'Connor's fortified compound in the northern suburbs. The details of what happened inside that compound were never printed in the papers, but by dawn, the O'Connor syndicate had ceased to exist. Declan O'Connor was gone, erased from the city's map, and Gabriel had reclaimed his throne. Only this time, he was leaving room beside it. 6 months later, the dust had settled. Rossi Imports was more powerful than ever, its absolute dominion over the city undisputed. The terror of Gabriel's retribution had rippled through every boardroom, every dark alley, and every elite country club in the Midwest. The annual spring gala for the Chicago Commerce Board was being held at the Field Museum. It was the premier event of the season, a gathering of the city's political elite and corporate titans. A hush fell over the Grand Stanley Field Hall as Gabriel Rossi arrived. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, exuding an aura of absolute terrifying command. But all eyes were on the woman holding his arm, Claire Jenkins. Now Claire Rossi stepped into the light. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. She wore a breathtaking, custom-designed gown of deep sapphire silk that hugged every glorious, heavy curve of her body. The bodice was encrusted with real diamonds, and a delicate diamond tiara rested in her styled hair. She looked radiant, powerful, and undeniably beautiful. The soft, insecure accountant who had tried to shrink herself into a corner was dead. The woman standing beside the city's most dangerous man was a queen who finally knew her worth. As they walked down the grand staircase, the crowd parted for them instantly. Men who used to ignore Claire now bowed their heads in deep, fearful respect. Women who used to snicker behind her back now looked at her with pure, unadulterated envy. They spotted Jessica Arrington, the HR director, who had laughed at Ryan's cruel joke a year ago standing near a dinosaur exhibit. Jessica went deathly pale, her champagne glass trembling so violently the liquid spilled onto her dress. She quickly looked down, too terrified to even make eye contact with Claire. Claire felt a smirk tug at the corner of her lips. She didn't feel the need for petty revenge. Their terror was enough. Gabriel's hand rested securely on the small of her back, his thumb rubbing soothing, possessive circles against her spine. "Look at them," Gabriel murmured in her ear, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. "They are looking at a goddess, and they know it." "They're looking at you, Gabriel," she teased softly, leaning her heavy body comfortably against his side. "They're terrified of you. Good," Gabriel said, stopping near the center of the hall. He turned to face her, completely ignoring the hundreds of powerful people watching them. He reached out, his hands cupping her full, round cheeks. "Let them fear me. Let them know that I am the monster in the dark. But let them also know that the monster only bows to one person." He leaned down and kissed her, deeply and passionately, right there in the middle of the gala. It was a claim, a warning, and a promise all wrapped into one. Claire kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders, feeling the heavy, solid reality of his love. When he pulled away, Gabriel kept his arm wrapped tightly around her thick waist. He surveyed the room, his cold slate-gray eyes daring anyone to challenge them. No one did. She had been the heavy girl everyone rejected. The punchline, the afterthought. But Gabriel Rossi had seen the masterpiece beneath the world's cruelty. He had claimed her, fought for her, and burned a city down to keep her. Claire rested her head against Gabriel's chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat. She took a deep breath, letting her body take up all the space it needed, knowing that in Gabriel's arms she was exactly where she belonged. And heaven help the fool who ever tried to tell her otherwise.